In this video, we're going to take a very careful look at how one goes about evaluating students. And in particular, we've made a point throughout this semester of identifying that there's two parts of mathematics. There's the procedural, and we've talked about the procedural as being kind of verb-like when we think about it in terms of things that you do. And it's possible to do things that you don't really understand. And so I think it's fairly obvious that there's a conceptual part as well. And that's what we were referring to as the noun part. Now, this noun-like and verb-like, or procedural and conceptual aspect of mathematics is extremely important if we're going to be evaluating students. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through what I always called the sigma placement grid, which is a way of summing up, there's the sigma there, summing up what we know about evaluation, in particular when we realize that there are these two aspects that we have to examine. We have to make sure that the students can get a correct answer efficiently. That's procedural. But perhaps more important, we have to make sure that they understand the concepts that enable them to use these type of answers in a meaningful fashion. What we will find is that by identifying 4 types of student thinking, we can get a very, very good handle on where our students are actually coming from and how as teachers we can help meet their needs so that they'll be better able to address math in a productive and powerful problem-solving fashion. Clearly, we want our students to be able to do more than just get a correct answer. That can be done with a calculator. Like the horse problem helped us learn, it's understanding what's going on that enables us to really start using math in a powerful fashion. So without any further ado, let's walk our way through now the sigma placement grid and how we can use this information to help our students so that they can all be in the best of all possible situations where they get a correct answer, they know why it's correct, and they feel positive and good about what it is that they've done. Sigma, for those of you who might remember your statistics, is a shorthand way of summing things up, of adding together everything that has been in place. And I always viewed this as kind of a summing up of what we understood about how to assess students. And again, it relies on this notion that to really understand, you have to be able to get a correct answer efficiently and understand the mathematics that that answer is based upon. And so we're going to take a look at how we can use this two-way thinking about math, in particular the way students understand it, and develop a way of placing them into some working groups. First of all, when we start, we have to find an item for a content area that we wish to evaluate the students on. And for all of us here in the state of Texas, that's going to be based on the TEKS. So in here, when we're talking about the interview items, you'll notice that there is an interview. That means we have to interact with the students a little bit here, or observe them working in their groups of 4, or having this based on professional judgment. But in either case, it has to be based on one of the content areas. And of course, in the state of Texas, when we talk content area, that's a code word for TEK. And so you need to be aware that we're thinking of the TEKs at this point directly. Now, the first thing that we ask ourselves is whether or not the student was able to get a correct answer. This is the procedural end, isn't it? Can you get a correct answer? And that's really all we're going to concern ourselves with at this point is a yes, no. Were we able to get a correct answer or not? And if we were, then we'll take that information. If we were not, we would take that information. Now, when we think about it, this is what a standard paper and pencil test will give us. Whether it's a STAR test, or whether it's an end of chapter test, or whether it's a test that you created as a teacher. If it's just a paper and pencil test, this is what you look for. Were you able to get a correct answer? Or were you not able to get a correct answer? And what I hope you realize is what you're checking for at this point is just procedural. Do you have a process in place that enables you to get a correct answer? We're not saying whether you understand what that process is or even if it's effective. For example, some students can get a correct answer and their process is they sit next to someone who's really smart and they copy from their work. Now, obviously, that doesn't count very far in terms of conceptual understanding. We really don't know if someone gets a correct answer at this level, whether it's due to understanding, whether it's due to being seated next to smart people. I had one student who said that they got their answers through divine intervention. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you could get a correct answer, I suppose, without really understanding mathematics. And on the STAR test or any other multiple choice test, quite often you just get them by lucky guessing. So we want to get beyond that, but I don't want to get too far ahead of us right now. Let's take a look at one possible branch through this and see what happens next. After we've identified whether the student was able to get a correct answer or not, you'll notice that's easy. Is the answer 42 or did they miss it? We ask ourselves whether they can demonstrate conceptual understanding. And again, you'll see that there's yes, they're able to demonstrate conceptual understanding, or no, they were not able to demonstrate conceptual understanding. Well, how can this be shown? Turns out there's a number of ways you can determine whether or not a student really understands what they're doing. And I'm going to suggest that a very simple way is for you to just ask them. Ask them to explain their work to you. Ask them to explain in terms of how can you tell? Remember that question, how can you tell? It goes back to the because. I can tell because, and then judge whether or not their explanation makes sense. And what you will find is, as a professional who understands the modeling that we've developed so far in this semester, your professional judgment is going to be correct around 80 to 85% of the time. And I'm not just basing this off of random numbers. This is based off of almost a 30-year series of research studies by myself and former doctoral students of mine. We've looked at over 25,000 cases. And so this is pretty solid data at this point. Your professional judgment at this point should be trusted and valued. So we'll build a little bit further in terms of using the problem-solving board as a way of making this judgment also in the next video. But for now, I want you to recognize that if you just trust your professional judgment, you're going to be able to determine with a high degree of reliability and validity whether the student has a conceptual understanding or whether the student does not have conceptual understanding. So what does that mean? Well, if we understand conceptually and we have a process, I'm labeling that as P plus or process plus and concept plus or C plus. So our little abbreviation here, P plus, C plus, that's group one. This is where we want all of our students to actually be functioning. We want them to get these answers. We want them to be able to do it efficiently and correctly, and then also to be able to understand what it is that they're doing. Unfortunately, it's possible to get a correct answer and not really understand. I gave you a few examples earlier, somewhat facetiously, where we talked about perhaps sitting next to the smartest student in class, or just having a lucky guess. I think we all can agree it's possible for us to get a correct answer and not really understand why that answer is correct. An example that might be familiar to a lot of you is TurboTax or some other tax preparation software. If you enter the numbers incorrectly, it'll give you the correct answer of what you should pay or what money you'll get back. And it doesn't require you to understand a thing about tax law, which is probably a good thing in most cases. Now, What we do at this point is we do something rather unusual, and that is we ask the same question for the students who do not get a correct answer, who do not have the process or the procedure. And this always surprised a lot of educators because the assumption is that if you can't get a correct answer, then you will not be able to understand what's going on. And that assumption is really baked into a lot of people's mindsets to the point that even suggesting that you can understand what's going on conceptually and yet not get a correct answer is a bit of a surprise. Of all features of this evaluation model, this is the part that most people have the most difficulty in understanding. Most people can recognize how you can get a correct answer and understand. They also tend to recognize when you can get a correct answer and not understand. This group over here, though, when we get to it, tends to be the group that is most surprising, particularly for people using this method in evaluation. Now, the one that is least surprising is our group 3 students, and you'll notice the way we're labeling them. Process, no, they don't have a process. Concept, no, they don't understand. This is what we expect. We expect if students are not able to get a correct answer, they also cannot demonstrate conceptual understanding. And this is the assumption that most people work on in standard evaluation. Now, when we think about our 4th group, this is a group that can not get a correct answer. However, they do understand conceptually. This is an interesting group. And in fact, in some of the districts that I've worked with through the years, we would specifically target this group as a way of identifying GT students. You might think that's surprising, but let's think about why. Quite often, the GT students are gifted simply because they see so many connections. They see so many alternate ways of coming up with a correct answer that it takes them longer because they're thinking more deeply. It's relatively easy to memorize a procedure. And so if we memorize a procedure, that's going to put us in one of these 2 groups, and that tends to be relatively easy. For a group like this, you have to really have intellectual integrity and honesty to the point where you're thinking as a student, I really want to understand this. I better think it through. I better understand it. And it slows you down sometimes, but your concepts, your conceptual development is quite often more deeply ingrained than it is just to memorize a process. There's clearly a lot more here that I could go into, but I just want you to recognize that this group does exist. And we're going to start looking at now some percentages. So you'll see to what degree students will typically fall into one of these 4 groups in an initial evaluation. I put a dashed line through the center of this just to reiterate in our minds that over here, you'll notice that we have process in both cases. Over here, we are lacking process in both cases. So that reflects this yes-no dichotomy up here. So again, on the left side, we have process. On the right side, we do not have process. And our abbreviations, we're using P for process, C for concept. In our groups, we can see whether or not a specific group has process or concept based by following this little flow chart here in terms of were they able to get a correct answer and were they able to demonstrate that they understand what's going on to an observer or through some other mechanism. Now, when we look at students on an initial pass, on their first pass through the evaluation, and we ask ourselves, were they able to get a correct answer? What typically is the case is you'll have about 70% of your students that will get a correct answer on the first pass. This is prior to any remediation or reteaching. That means then that 30% of our students are not able to get a correct answer. So of the 100%, in a classroom or a district or a school that are being evaluated, typically the first pass will give you 70% that are getting correct answers, 30% that are not getting correct answers. Now, of that same 100%, here's where things get interesting. 30% of them are able to get into group 1. And again, this is based on this 25,000 student sample pool through the years. Some of it was done through individual student interviews. Some were done using Sato's student problem analysis. There's a lot of ways of getting there. Some of it's statistical, some of it is not. And in either case, what is interesting is that your own professional judgment does a better job identifying students than the statistical analysis. So that's why I said earlier, trust your own judgment on this. You've been trained now through this methods course to where you can make this decision. So we've got 30% there. Well, that means then that of that 70% of the total, 40% are in group 2, and this should be concerning for us. It means then that the assumption of the test is not being met. The assumption of the test was that if you get a correct answer, you should also understand what's going on. And yet what we see is the majority of cases here, 40% compared to 30% can get a correct answer, but they're not understanding what the answer means or how it was generated at any conceptual level. This is reflective of teaching procedural knowledge and leaving out the conceptual component. And I hope we've built a strong enough case for you by now in this class where you recognize the danger of this approach in teaching. When we finish our work now and we ask ourselves, okay, how many of us are in group 3 now? You will notice that it's 20% of the total, which means that we have 10% of the total in group 4. And again, this is very surprising to a number of our colleagues that you can have students who can't get a correct answer and yet still understand concept, and in many cases at a deeper or alternate level than that which they've had a chance to experience in the classroom. So 40% in group 2, that's not good. It basically tells us that when we see the results of a standardized assessment or a chapter test or the STAR test or any paper and pencil assessment that just looks at whether you're getting a correct answer or not, you're going to be mislabeling a number of the students. In fact, if we take that 70%, all right, that means that 40 of the 70% is being mislabeled. And this is a sad situation, as we'll come back to. This group of students in many ways have the hardest task ahead of them as they try to move over into group 1, because that's where we want our students to be, isn't it? We want them to be able to get a correct answer, and we want them to be able to understand why that answer is correct. Group 3 students, no real surprise here. And so what we find is if we're just thinking about a test, what is it a test does well? What the test does to the best degree is predict failure. You'll notice that 20 of the 30, or 2/3 here, of the students in this group really do follow the categorization of the test. That is, that they were not able to get a correct answer, and they also don't understand. And so that understanding of the test is met. You'll notice it is not met in the group 2 students, though. Over here, we can't say necessarily that a high score correlates to real understanding. All we can say is that a high score on a test tells us that we have a procedure of who knows what nature that enables our students to get a correct answer, not necessarily that they understand. So what can we do with this information in terms of building a classroom environment? We'll hit more on this after we talk about the problem-solving board in the following video and when we talk about classroom considerations. But for now, I want to kind of front load it for you with a couple of ideas here. And the first idea has to do with some simple student grouping that you may not have thought about. And that is that if we take our students in group 1 and we group them with our students in group 4, that gives us a natural synergy that we would often miss if we weren't aware of this type of student thinking. And I think I can explain why for you. Remember earlier when we categorized these students as often being our GT students, because they came up with an alternate conception, and in some cases, despite the best instruction we could give them, if you see what I mean. So when these students don't have their needs met, in other words, they're not recognized for their gifts, it's very easy for them to go into group 3. And I would suggest that if we don't catch them by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade, it's almost too late. So those of you who want to work with the little ones, please, please, please develop those concepts early, because these students' ways of thinking are too valuable for us to waste and have them go into this give up kind of mode over here. If we think of a group 4 student and they're interacting now with someone in group 1, these guys are so happy because they're finally being paired up with some of the smartest people in class. And whether we like to recognize it or not, most students kind of have a sense of who the kids are that understand and get the right answer all the time, and who the ones are that do not. And so for these students to be working now with students from group 1 is a really wonderful thing for them. So it's a win. We've got a win for our group 4 students. They're finally paired up with some really smart kids. Turns out that it's a real benefit in another way, and that is, what is the easiest thing to teach? Well, the easiest thing to teach is a process. All you have to do is follow the steps. You turn the crank, as a lot of students will say, and you'll get the correct answer. So since that's such an easy thing to say, if we have group 1 and group 4 students working together, the group 1 students will teach the group 4 students the process, in many ways doing a better job than what you and I can do as teachers, because they're at the same developmental level. They know the same problems. They know the same kid talk, as it were, in terms of how to describe the process. I've seen it happen in as short a period of time as 5 minutes in one day. So these kids are getting their needs met, a wonderful thing. Turns out it's also a win for the group 1 students, and this is what we often forget. Well, how is it a win for them? They're seeing different ways and different approaches and different concepts, because these group 4 students are not the lowest in the class. They're fairly, in many cases, the best of the class. And they have these wild, crazy, imaginative, out of the box ways of solving the problems. And these two groups just hit it off, and they do wonderfully together. So that's our first grouping that surprises some people. And if we're aware of these 4 types of student thinking, you can almost start picturing how to make this play out in your own teaching, I'm sure. Now, the next thing we do is we're going to group 2 and group 3. We have some of the same synergy. The kids in group 3 are thinking, wow, I'm working with some of the smartest people in class, and they recognize that. And in fact, the group 2 students, because they have memorized the process, sometimes are faster than those in group 1. So they're going to be able to teach the process, again, probably easier than we can, to group 3. So that's a win. And as teacher, look what we're going to be doing. We're going to be teaching the concepts. And in fact, as we will talk about in classroom considerations, we'll be focusing the majority of our instruction directly upon groups 2 and 3, focusing upon concept. So the plus here is really great. They get the process from their group 2 peers. They get the concept from the teacher working with them. Group 2 gets concept taught in a focused fashion from the teacher. And it seems like it's a win-win, and a lot of good things can come out of this in a best possible scenario. So let's take a look at what happens. Basically, our group 4 students all at once become group 1. Why? Because group 1 teaches them the process. And once they know the process, you'll notice that at that point, they have both process and concept. So they become group 1 students. What a wonderful thing. That's what we'd like to have happen for all of our students. Now, group 3, what will tend to happen is they will tend to learn the concept first. And that's because the teacher is focused so much on generating that, and they don't have the baggage of having to unlearn a process. They can just focus on learning that concept. Once they learn the concept, they are now part of group 4, and we already know what happens with group 4 students. They eventually become group 1 students. What a lovely path, isn't it? To go from not knowing and not understanding to where you're in the fastest group in the class. Now, when we talk about group 2, in an ideal world, it's a little tricky. But in an ideal world, you have to get those group 2 students to where they don't understand and where their answers are no longer correct, even for a short period of time. There's an old saying you've probably heard, if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. And that's group 2 students to a T. They're getting all this praise for getting the correct answer. They recognize that, and yet at some level, I think they know they don't understand. I know there's a lot of times in my life where I can get a correct answer without really understanding why that answer is correct, and it doesn't feel good. All right, it just doesn't feel good. I feel bad for students in group 2 because they're this huge majority of students, and yet their needs are not being met the way things are set up. But we'll set that aside for now, and we'll say, in an ideal world, what happens? Well, maybe we're working on addition, and so we have them use a base 5 instead of base 10. You know, so that's a good opportunity. Their memory will no longer give them a correct answer because it's in an alternate base, and they have to focus on the concept. So for at least one small period, their process won't work, and so by definition, they're in group 3. And then they learn the concept, and then life is good because they get to move over into group 1. But you'll notice, again, this is predicated on this notion that their procedures no longer work, even for a short period of a single classroom. You have to get them in a position where they recognize, oh my gosh, there's something broken here I need to fix. And then they can go through this process of working over into group 1. Group 2 really is in a rough shape though, and I think we can kind of think why. They may not think it's worth the effort. Hey, I'm getting the correct answer. I mean, come on, I get 100% on every test. I'm the first one done. What's your problem? You can almost hear it, can't you? And having to learn this concept, that takes a lot of time and hard work, and I'm just not going to do it. You'll see that. I wish I could tell you you won't, but you'll see that, especially when you hit grades 4 and 5 and 6. They'll get to the point where they don't really want to play ball with you, as it were, particularly if it hits their self-esteem where they realize their process is not working because that's all they've got. See, they know they don't understand the concept. They're very much aware of that. And all you have to do is just ask, how can you tell, and watch them kind of pull back. It's interesting because group 1 students, they volunteer. Miss, sir, I want help me. I'll give you the answer. Let me go up to the board. I'll show it to you. These guys, they're okay. They'll give you the answer, but don't call them to go on the board, if you see what I mean. The other thing that'll happen in this particular group, though, is in a worst case scenario, they stay in group 2 and they still get a correct answer. That's not a horrible situation to be in. Let's face it, in many cases, that's actually a pretty good position to be in. It'd be great if we could get them in group 1. That would be wonderful. Think of the increased power they would have in their thinking, but at least they're getting correct answers. So it's not a horrible situation to be in. But still, I would like to see everyone make that transition into group 1. Now, when we think of group 1, this really is the gold standard. This is what I think we should be shooting towards as we work with our students. We want them to be able to understand what they're doing. We build a whole semester now focusing on developing conceptual understanding, and I hope that I'm not just saying something that doesn't resonate with you. We really want our students to understand what they're doing so that they can have mathematical flexibility, so that they can use math for reasoning, for problem solving, for communication, for connections. Those are the process standards of the TEKS. And those are the ones that are notoriously difficult to teach because people try to teach them as a checklist or something to memorize. I think by now you realize there's a little more to it than that. In particular, when we look at that, there. I hope you recognize by this point that there is a little bit more to it than just memorizing a way of teaching. You have to understand what's going on. What I have pushed throughout this semester is before you can teach something as a teacher, you have to understand it as a learner. And so there was a lot of activities I've had you go through where you are required to rethink your understanding in a new way, starting with the horse problem and working all our way up through the fraction and decimal models. I'm hoping that you were able to take some of this information and reconceptualize your role as a teacher. Your role is not just to give problems from a book and then see if they can answer them correctly or not. That gives you your first level of understanding in the Sigma grid as we talked about, and you'll end up mislabeling 40% of the students in your class. You don't want to do that, especially when you realize that it's the group 2 students. They're going to think that they are getting understanding. They're going to think they understand, and yet all they have is a process, and they're missing out on so very much. And it's that very much that's essential for mathematical problem solving, reasoning, communication, and connections. The other thing that you'd be doing is you'll be cheating yourself out of that 10% of the GT population. Not that they're all GT, but a lot of them are. That 10% who, despite the best we tried for, still understand, that really have their own ways of coming to understand what's going on. They have so much to offer to our classroom as well as to our society. And we really do not want to disenfranchise those students and their thinking by not recognizing them and helping them flourish in an environment that supports mathematics to its fullest extent.